So thank you for joining us today. We are really happy to start another event in our series called Sources of Choice. It was designed to discuss issues related to historical research and knowledge production about war and in the face of the war. In this series, we try to have a look at what discussions and politics are happening behind the process of documentation and studying military conflicts across the world for the 20th and 21st centuries in general, but of course, with a special focus on Russia's war against Ukraine. This program of events is organized with the support of the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure. And I'm really happy to introduce our today's speaker, Professor Peter Haslinger, historian and director of the Heder Institute in Marburg, a significant research center when it comes to studying the history of Eastern Europe. And Dr. Haslinger is also a professor of the history of Eastern Europe at the Gießen Center for Eastern European Studies. His main research interests are related to the history of East Central Europe, Habsburg Empire and successor states in 19th and 20th centuries. Among his other research interests are cultures of memory and questions of identity, historical discourse analysis, cultures of knowledge in transnational contexts. Today's talk is titled Russia's War Against Ukraine and the Position of German Historians, the significance of this debate for collaboration in the field of humanities, in the field of digital humanities. It will consist of a few parts elaborating on various issues that the historical community in Germany specifically, but not only, is dealing with in the face of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We also invited our dear colleague, Dr. Mykola Mahortik from the University of Bern to give a short commentary on the Dr. Haslinger's talk afterwards. I hope it will also support this interdisciplinary nature of our discussion. And then there will be opportunity for questions and discussions from the audience. So I very much invite you to send your comments or questions either in the chat during the talk already, or raise your hand to ask questions after the talk. Now, without further ado, I'm passing the microphone to Professor Haslinger. Thank you for joining us today. Please, the mic is yours.
Yeah, thank you. And hello to everybody, wherever they are. And let's keep our fingers crossed that we will have time and energy and electricity for the discussion after this talk. I would like to start with some kind of a disclaimer, which has also to do with an important aspect of my presentation. So as Taras, and thank you very much, I have to really say this, thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor and a pleasure to speak here. So the disclaimer is that I'm not an expert in Ukrainian history. I know Ukrainian history in a more general way as we were taught this at universities. I'm Austrian and my university is the University of Vienna. So I have a kind of basic knowledge of Ukrainian history, but I have also different perspective of what's going on and the debates that are just emerging in Germany. And I will make that clear at another point. What I want, so I will share my screen, if I may, in order to guide you through the presentation. Can you see the screen in the presentation mode? Wonderful, good. So what are the main aspects of my presentation? First, in order to give some information about the institute which I'm director of, I want to just give a brief information about what we're doing and what our collections look like. I think there is also for the discussion, there is some ample room for discussing collaboration schemes. And then I will just step into the very topic, the position of German historians on Russia's war against Ukraine, followed by the consequences, some consequences for the state of the art in the digital humanities, which I see, and where I think the the work that the VIV team of the Center for Urban Studies is doing is an exquisite example of how to manage a difficult situation. I will say more about this. And then I will end with some points of where I see the challenge, and this decolonize is kind of framed because I'm not very happy with this term, but still, this is basically the challenge. So just briefly about the Institute, for those who don't know it, it was founded in 1950, so at the beginning of the Cold War, so to speak, and it had his Herder Institute had a special function, kind of accepting all these professors from territories and universities in the East that were looking for a new kind of anchor in Western Germany. And the Institute went through some kind of phases of development, starting with a rather German-based kind of closed worldview on the lost territory, so to speak, but it emerged as one of the centers or hubs for collaboration even before the end of the Cold War. Now we're an institute that focuses on the history and culture of Central and Eastern Europe, meaning that history is the main discipline, but we also have expertise in art history and historical geography. You see the collections, and I don't want to go into detail about this. We have the most important thing, we have collection of any kind except art objects, so no paintings, no sculptures, but the rest is cross-sectionally represented in our holdings. And what is already an important point to take with us into the discussion is that we see very closely the relevant questions that are connected with curation and digital curation when it comes to this cross-sectional archive collections, museum collections, and libraries in this respect. The countries we cover and kind of what stands East Central Europe for are the three Baltic states, Poland, and former Czechoslovakia. This is the core territory, but we also do research and have some collections on more countries. Ukraine is among them, also Hungary and Belarus. Since 2015, where a Department for Digital Humanities and Infrastructures was founded, we had quite an impressive record of emerging into the field of digital humanities. Some things you can see here on the slide. Important is this one, if you see the cursor. So the National Research Data Infrastructure is an all-encompassing national endeavor to base digital infrastructures across all disciplines on a firm and solid and sustainable basis. And just Friday, we were very happy to see that the Historical Consortium for Memory received funding. And in this frame, we are, so the Herder Institute is also responsible building up a focus group on Central and Eastern European studies. And this is a point where, Taras, we will have different, I think, video meetings about this. Also important is this point, career development. I think this is a very important point, which I'll make clear in a minute. The last slide of introduction, we are a member of the Leibniz Association, which, as you can see, is one of the 4 extramural scientific organizations in Germany. Everybody knows the Max Planck Institutes, Fraunhofer, Helmholtz, and Leibniz. And we are part of the Section A, Humanities and Educational Studies. I'm also the spokesperson of something which also is I think, a good platform for further collaboration, the Leibniz Central and Eastern Europe Network. Here you see, by the way, the brochure in Germany, which has this beautiful bridge on the cover. Of course, we are very active when it comes to helping and assisting Ukraine and Ukrainian colleagues in this dramatic situation. So if you want to learn more about the Herder Institute, just go for it in the Q&A section. But now, kind of stepping into into the topic. German historians and how they reacted to Russia's war against Ukraine. I will have some quotes of prominent representatives, but here's some general points. There is a high demand for historical expertise and, first of all, factual knowledge among the general public. There are every university and every center like ours has a whole portfolio of retrieving information into any kind of the public sphere. There is also within the Leibniz Association a very interesting format where you can book scientists, book a scientist, that's the title. And I was booked also by mayors and simple persons who just wanted to know what is this, the Kiev Rus. Well, so actually the factual knowledge is very slim in Germany. So German society has a lot of kind of blank spots regarding this. And all the colleagues I know who have some basic knowledge about anything regarding Ukraine are quite active. And there is also, and that's the second point, a high media presence of many of our colleagues. I've kind of grouped some screenshots from big players like Karl Schlögl, here's Martin Schulze-Wessel, Ricarda Vulpius, Maren Röger. This is an article in the Spiegel, one of the most influential journals in Germany, by Anna Veronika Wendland, and here's Jörg Bawarowski. So these are only a few of those who are present in the media, and it's quite time consuming and quite stressful sometimes. But here is actually one more critical point. So on the radio and the print and online media, German historians or historians in Germany are very present, less on the television. That has to do with these roundtable discussions where more political scientists or experts in military affairs are present. Also, actually, our learning of military affairs has increased a lot from 0 to, I wouldn't say 100, but at least 80. So this is also, we leaped into a world where military related information matters. And we had that to embed it into kind of our way of thinking, because kind of military and humanists also always are a bit hard to couple. So we have many opportunities and also see a high commitment also not only of the kind of best known professors, but also across all of our discipline. But we also have a high pressure of expectation and a wide variety of project funding. So there's a activism from all foundations and all kinds of presidencies of universities. And this is also very time consuming. It's of course very good that this activity is there. But to my astonishment, the low interest of politicians is also to mention here. So they're not interested so much into historical background knowledge, but rather into these kind of strategic geopolitical things. And all the time we're asked to explain what goes on in Putin's head. So that's kind of the main demand side. I'm fed up about this, but this is also our task. Now, turning to the community of historians itself, in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea and the attack, so that the war breaking out in eastern Ukraine, we had some controversies about how to classify this and what's the very nature of this war against Ukraine. So I just mentioned as an example the controversy between Jörg Bawarowski and Anna Veronika Wendland, kind of accusing each other a little bit of being too partisan in this debate. And it took a while via kind of declarations and so on. It took a while for the Eastern European studies, as we call ourselves, or Eastern European history, to come to the same point. This is absent now. So with February 24th, I think with some kind of different aspects in the foreground and in the background, we have no controversies about the nature of the war, that it's an aggressive war, that's an imperial war, that it's kind of not justifiable by any historical reasoning whatsoever. We have controversies, not open ones, but very subtle ones, and I will introduce some of them. How to assess Ukraine as a historical subject, and what is the kind of consequence of for the concept of Russian Soviet and post-Soviet history, and what we do in teaching, but also research. And these debates focus around the concept of decolonization. I think I lead into the debate, so I don't give a whole picture here, but I will, in a second or so, will lead into the debate in order for you to understand why certain arguments are important and why they are typically, let's say, German. I'm not stereotyping here, but I think there's a point to it. And I would begin with Joachim von Puttkammer, who again, a very balanced colleague, so in his assessments, and he sees three major aspects. First, we can make the history of Ukraine as an independent nation understandable in the European context. I think there's a lot to do here, not for the Ukrainian side. I think you are far ahead, but in kind of transponing this or transferring this into German academia, I see still a lot to do here. Second, the relationship between Russian and Ukrainian society, the intertwinement, but also the alienation of recent years, as Joachim von Puttkammer puts it. And third, the scholarly controversies about Russians' justification for the war. And that much of this is directly related to German history. So we also talk about the war as in relation to, first of all, World War II, and kind of the responsibility of German academia and German historians, foremostly, how to remember, how to deal with it, how to kind of deal with one's own responsibilities as experts on historical matters. One hint, this is a typical, so Joachim von Puttkammer in this interview talks about Ukraine, of course, but this approach, seeing the war basically through the lens of one's involvement with Russian history. I'm not judging here, but I'm just pointing to the fact this is something that I found a little bit problematic. And this is not the only quote that you will see in this respect. Actually, there's an interesting format. So many of these interviews and radio or TV, first of all, radio programs are organized on a bilateral level. And this is a good thing. So it's not talking about one side or about the other, being cleverer as everyone, but kind of engaging into a dialogue. But it's, on the other hand, you see here Jörg Barbarowski, who is in dialogue with Jurko Prochaska, which is remarkable, however, is that historians normally don't talk to historians. They talk to literary scientists who know German language. So these are public radio emissions. So, but this special feature is something good. I will follow with some quotes from Jörg Barbarowski, where one can see that his deep involvement with, he's an expert on Stalinism, and kind of the Soviet Union and repression. He's also an expert in the history of violence. And these quotes I brought with me are from excerpts from this dialogue. And first of all, many colleagues get personal, and I think that's a good thing to do. I was shocked as well. So I thought something would happen, but I wouldn't have thought that it would be that brutal and with no exit strategy. That was the most scary thing about it. But Jörg Babarowski also says that he was shocked by the news of the attack. That's the quote at the bottom of the slide. And he asked himself, why do they know what they're doing? And he relates this to kind of an interior Russian perspective. So breaking resistance, not only in Ukraine, but also finishing off with the internal enemy. And also the quote above, he talks about Ukrainian special, of course, in other parts of the interview. But I see that the lens is an all-encompassing, not limited to Ukrainian perspectives or affairs or whatever, the Ukrainian territory, but the kind of comparison to other parts of former Soviet Union are quite visible. Also with Moritz Florin's piece on Central Asia and the decolonization of East European studies, he talks of a sense of failure, something that reminds us a little bit of 1989, where hardly anyone foresaw the fall of the Berlin Wall. But still, this entanglement from positively imperial histories and narratives is visible here. And this is an uncertainty that's quite obvious in many parts of historical debates today. So the new imperial history has been accused of presenting an overly idealized picture of the Russian Empire, tolerance, multiculturalism, and kind of the decolonizing rhetoric or anti-imperialistic rhetoric, as Moritz Florin says, has been too often taken at its word. And he calls for decolonization in a way that will not leave us with narratives of a purely national victimization. This is a very ambivalent suggestion. I will come back to this point. Here, actually, we have the classical and often cited definition of decolonization by Jan Jansen and Jürgen Osterhammel, a historically unique and presumable, irreversible delegitimization of any rule perceived as a subject relationship towards foreigners. And three authors, Kindler, Ruprecht, and Urbanski, come up with the suggestion that I noticed from other debates as well. The German historical community has problems with kind of how to stand towards political agency or politically frameable agency. That's, of course, a good deal of homework we have from the 1920s, 1930s through to the 1950s. I don't want to go into detail about this, but the shock of being instrumentalized by politics and not even being instrumentalized, also going right ahead and kind of fabricating concepts for political use. This is still very deep embedded in our community, and that's a good thing. On the other hand, the suggestion at this slide that we should divide up kind of a strictly academic and a strictly political activistic stance. I have problems with that. And I see there's a concern, which I can understand, a concern about losing one's subject and backsliding methodologically into national history, which is kind of thought to be overcome in Germany, kind of national history as the narrow-minded way to conceptualize human development. And now it's rather European or entangled history. That's the point, or that's the kind of lens to look through. And my critique, however, would be that this suggestion to decolonize Soviet or post-Soviet history is just, without knowing, reproducing the mental map of the Soviet Union, just turning around, kind of exchanging centers and peripheries. and trying to take the kind of perspective of the periphery towards the center, but not dissolving the mind map altogether. So this is something that counts for, let's say, the time from 18th or 19th century to the present, but it doesn't do justice to the much more differentiated and complicated historical development of Ukrainian territories. Okay, Martin Schulze-Wessel, I think, had some very good points in a newspaper article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine from July. And this is I think, really noteworthy. We need, that's what he's saying, without an appropriate conceptual apparatus, the historical cultural foundations of war are not recognizable. That is a bit for kind of thinking about what our tools, apparatuses, and epistemic perspectives are. And to cast a post-colonial perspective on Russia, says Martin Schulze-Wessel, means to consistently question the knowledge that has been constructed and canonized with the help of the Russian state. And now a warning is also included here. The post-colonial emancipation of Ukraine by means of national historical politics is a vulnerable perspective, not only from Imperial Russian, from the Imperial Russian side, that wouldn't be bad, but also from a post-national Western perspective. So what he's saying is basically arguing in a kind of mode of national empowerment historiography creates ambivalent kind of feedbacks basically from the German sides, where this way to write history is overcome basically. Another example for someone who has very early engaged in Ukrainian history is Andreas Kappeler. He's Swiss, but he spent part of his career in Germany and now Austria. And actually he points us to, and here's also the kind of change of the picture. He points us to the fact that his academia in Germany has a different logic to do regional or area studies when it comes to history. We don't have national or chairs like in Canada or the United States, where there are chairs for Polish or Hungarian or Ukrainian history. We have chairs for the sub-regions of what we call Osteuropa, so Eastern Europe in a broader sense. We have Russian and Soviet or post-Soviet history, including Central Asia and the Caucasus region. We have East Central Europe, that is kind of the Visegrad states basically, and we have Southeast Europe, the Balkans. And this means that the smaller nation, and Ukrainian in this respect would classify as a smaller nation, are always in the shadow of the more logic nations. Also, Czech history is very badly represented at universities. There's no chair for Slovak history or anything else, but we have extramural institutions taking care of this. But and I think he's right in saying, Andreas Kappeler, that this neglect of a structural will to build up chairs with a clear Ukrainian denomination and focus. There's only one half professorship in Frankfurt Oder at the Viadrina by Prochy. And this is actually the only chair we have with this denomination. And he says that stands for not recognizing Ukraine as an equal historical subject. And there's some truth in this. So some takeaway messages before I take you in the field of digital humanities. I think the imperative, that these are now my points, I will somehow present in the debate. I think the imperative of the hour is not so much decolonizing. This is in regard to Russia's stance, this is a very important aspect. This is a valuable aspect, and it has to be done. But it doesn't fit to the needs how to deal with the history of Ukraine and also the institutional background to this. We have to recenter and come to a robust conceptualization of Ukraine as a historical subject. It might be in highly asymmetric and highly hierarchical circumstances, but the subjectivity of Ukraine should be much more highlighted to my sense. We need also a change of perspective. Normally, Ukraine was dealt with as some kind of a border or transition zone from the east to the west. We know that from other cases as well. This is, I think, a concept that can't be followed anymore. It has a validity because you can write the history of Ukraine with including all these aspects. But what we need is taking the historical entity of its own for serious and seeing it as an integral part of European development. I think there's a lot still to learn when you put yourself in these shoes and look at historical development. You can also learn a lot about the history of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire, of course. And we have to redefine Ukrainian historiography in regard to intersections with other national historiographies. Normally you do it kind of the Russian-Ukrainian axis, also Russia and Poland is very prominent. Actually, I don't know, perhaps I'm ignorant in this field, but there's not so much going on about this Romanian-Ukrainian, Slovak-Ukrainian, and Belarusian-Ukrainian axis, which I think if you look at the whole context would be incredibly exciting to have an in-depth look on these. And this kind of recenters Ukraine not only as a subject of its own, but also as a node in a complex network of historical developments that kind of intersect, but also are controversial to each other. And yeah, we have the dilemma, and you perhaps remember what I said as warning messages from some of the quotes. This leads us to the dilemma of historiographical state and nation building. And from a German perspective, we see, or many see, and I share that to some extent, the problem, or one has to be aware of avoiding into normative concepts, be it in normative concepts of national history, but also of European history that is directed towards the East. But we have to also avoid, and this is also for research in Germany, the epistemological perspective of Feindforschung, enemy research of any kind. And we need, of course, a structural and institutional empowerment of Ukrainian studies in Germany. And that won't happen with chairs or things like that, but could also happen with the help of the digital humanities. This is something which I published kind of a couple of, so in August in Germany and a couple of weeks ago in October, which is about the neutrality of data and data management, and how I would judge the impact of Russia's war against Ukraine in this respect. And of course, it's important when we look at how the war is managed from every side, it's important to look at Russian or Putin propaganda. He's a hobby historian that has spent obviously much free time in the Corona months to try to engage into historical thinking with some limited results, I would say. But also, and now I'm serious, I think this disentanglement and deprofessionalization of history, also institutionally and with the help of legal measures. So remember the end of the memorial network. This is, I think, taken for serious, and the thing that should not happen with writing a history of Ukraine is having the variety and the complexity of development and also the multi-perspectivity when it comes to kind of looking at the history of a country, of a society. That's what history lives from. And this is totally absent from also some prominent works and prominent not only speeches but also museums and so on. So it's not a multi-perspective. So multi-perspectivity is only valid when it legitimizes the power vertical. So kind of arguing with Islam is highly instrumental in Russia's or Putin's rhetoric. And if we look at data, everything that we know about data seem to be neutral and handy and structuring knowledge landscapes, but actually data are never objective, and they're full of biases and ideological convictions. We know that from our German kind of geographical or also subject data on the history of Eastern Europe, which had a long way from this post-NS, National Socialist kind of terminology to a terminology that is thought through, and we're still not at the end there. So what could be an interesting level for exchanging of thoughts? You must be confronted with the epistemic baggage that's in the data. I think there are some similarities. And first of all, how should we do with data, analog, but also digital in their digital representation? What methods and tools do we already have? So enriching data with context information about the biography of concepts or the biography of data structures, and how to reflect on this inherited legacies and burdens. And do it in a way that research is inspired by this, the way we do it and the outcomes we present. Another thing that will be a challenge in the future is, of course, hybrid wars. We didn't have yet a major attack on historical institutions or any kind of archives or anything like that. I'm not saying that I see signs that that will happen tomorrow, but still, you never know in times like these. So since history or historical arguments are so important for the legitimation of this war against Ukraine, we have to prepare for scenarios of hybrid challenges and hybrid attacks. And I think what's in the second half of this slide, two colleagues, by the way, who are based in Siegen, right around the corner here, is that the aims of disinformation, and there will be disinformation as soon as there is time and resources free for it, about historical content as well. The aims are to deconstruct coherence, disrupting collective meaning-making processes, and make it difficult to understand the present and harder to build a shared view of the past. And this is something I think we still can prepare for. I think this consortium for history in the National Infrastructure Initiative could be a place to think about this in depth. I know about the Lviv Center activities. I brought different examples in order to show or to clarify where I see also problems with that these are two portals where you can see by a kind of live basis the destructions and other things going on there, linked with social media posts of any kind. The Eyes on Russia portal, I don't know if you know this, but just briefly, the Eyes on Russia portal works together with Bellingcat, so there's some kind of a quality proof measures here. But if you look at the things posted, my concerns, this is good for now. And I think journalists draw a lot of detailed information from these, for portals like these. But these are sources of the future. And speaking from the point of view of digital source criticism, these are precarious data banks. So the sustainability might be an issue. Also legal standards. I see a lot of legal questions with the material that's uploaded. But first of all, authenticity and the integrity of data is not clear to me. How the fact checking, so they can't do a fact checking on everything that's uploaded. And this brings me to something the digital humanities have to, I think, be aware of also in the future even more. I see among my students the tendency to treat computers like truth machines. So you kind of want to know something, you type it in, press enter, and the truth appears on the screen. We have to, I think, be more human and more critical and less technical and quantitative, but rather hermeneutic, qualitative in this respect. We have to think through how technical issues generate research interests, and we have to avoid a situation where infrastructures and technical devices drive the kinds of questions that are allowed to ask. Also, the digitized material kind of pre-structures already our research questions. And that brings me to the second point by Eva Pflanzelter. So we had a debate on the future of history in a digital age. That's around 2015. And Eva Pflanzelter, a colleague from South Tyrol, by the way, tried to find out what our classical kind of auxiliary sciences, as we call them in Germany, Hilfswissenschaften, what is their role in the digital age? So do we have to change it altogether? Do we have to dispose of it and find something new? Or can kind of the methods that we have from from the 19th century and onward, can we adopt them to fit the digital challenge? And the most, one of the things she's worried about most is the abundance of information on the internet, but also the problem of authenticity. So in my article, I also say that we need to retrieve or to make future historians fit in the field of digital forensics. Otherwise, we will not be able to write or verify anything in a reasonable way. That this is not something that is new shows this slide. So it's a combination of maps or details from maps showing the same area. It's the Subcarpathian Ukraine, basically, so the Carpathian territory. But depending, so it's the same region, the same data, but the choice of methods and the choice of kind of map language prefigures the impression that we have. And I think what is important, I totally agree with Eva Pflanzelter, we don't need a totally renewed critique of historical sources, but we have to cleverly combine what we take with us from the analog or pre-digital era to the digital age, and kind of questioning the making of a document is very visible here. And this also goes together with the next two quotes. The digital helpers are full of theory and judgment already. There's a lot of studies now going on about algorithms kind of pre-designing outcomes in a racistic or sexistic way. And theory is at work when it comes to defining units of analysis, algorithms, and visual procedures, visualization procedures. But this is something where I see a lot of opportunity for collaboration with you guys in Ukraine, because you're very much trained, I think, in the position you're right in this drastic position you're right in. You have a different angle, a different perspective, and a different kind of reality-proof training, so to speak, on these materials. And I think this is a point where I see really a point where we should learn from you. Also, we could basically discuss the next question. So Eva Schlothäuber, she was the president of the spokesperson, president, I think is the right title, of the Association of Historians in Germany, and Frank Bösch also was part of the kind of board of this association. And they raise a very important question. So what are the skills of future generations of historians? We need to find a way to retrieve knowledge of how to deal with sources to people who are digital natives and kind of approach history from totally different contexts like computer games. And we have to teach them kind of not the classics of the source critique, but also media criticism expertise. In Germany, so we are not at the forefront of the digital change. In order to be polite to historians in Germany, we are rather in the last kind of among the last disciplines to digest the digital revolution, so to speak. But there are many portals, very professional ones, high quality, with quality management measures based on the implementation of FAIR principles. So here is much going on, and but we still have to talk about or reflect or contemplate about these two spheres that are given or represented by two quotes. So mass digitization is, Mareike König says, surprisingly unnoticed and untheoretized. We all work digital, but some wouldn't describe themselves as historians using digital methods, which is kind of a strange situation. And the methodological pitfalls this creates is, I think, something where we also have tasks in common where we can kind of engage into a dialogue. The second is from Andreas Fickers, who is the director of the Luxembourg Center for Contemporary and Digital History, one of the main hubs for digital humanities in the German-speaking, if you regard Luxembourg as part of the German-speaking countries, that would be a correct statement. And he points to something that we still are at the beginning of reflecting upon, the layered and distributed materiality of digital objects. So the concept of the original, which is very important to the traditional source critique, doesn't make any sense, because whenever you kind of browse in digital material, you create new originals. So it's not the question of the original, but rather the question of if this is authentic and if it's the integrity of these sources. There is also a portal that's organized and run by the Luxembourg Center. Very important questions where you can already see the leap from the classical source critique questions of interior and exterior source critique and so on and so forth, material, authors, audiences, and so on, to what does the digital do with our sources. And actually, we are also in contact with Andreas Fickers and will kind of include some modules coming from our collections to this portal. But this is something which these questions sound very neutral and kind of not doing anyone harm. These are questions that are extremely important when it comes to portals like the ones I showed to you, with kind of documenting war incidents and incidents of violence. Here you see kind of on the right-hand side, and this is one of the last slides I brought with me, the kind of for memory consortium. And these are my points, what I think we should take for serious when kind of trying to find a way to develop the competences of future historians. So we need ways to be transparent about anything that is related to digitization processes. The legal and ethical dimensions of digital knowledge become more and more important. So I we are talking about adopting not the fair but the care principles that come from anthropological studies in Northern America to historical subjects and critical of sensitive issues. We need to come to a way to critically assess the trends for algorithmization of historical sciences, the professional reputation, credibility of output in the digital sphere is still not guaranteed in Germany, and the strategic partnerships across boundaries, disciplinary as well as country borders, is at stake, and institutionalization. And here we have some concepts that we can dwell upon from library studies and cultural memory studies. These new organizational forms of collaborative networks. The historian is a lonesome fighter for his or her cause. We normally sit with our monographs and are a bit shy to dispose, or we are a bit shy to let someone else look into the sources we found in the archives. But this is something which has an expiring date. So, and actually, what you are doing in Lviv, but also elsewhere in Ukraine, with documenting a situation that will become historical, not in 10 years, not in 100 years, but in a couple of years, that is, I think, breathtaking as we see it from here. And the second also points to that actually we need to engage in network building with on eye level on the one hand, but also with an exchange or trading zone between curators and researchers, between German, please note these, and Ukrainian historians, between different disciplines, between information technology and humanities. And this is something we are also thinking about very intensely. So Taras, you gave an interview, and I'm kind of quoting you here with the concept of emergency archiving. I mentioned this also in some radio interviews I gave. I think everything that you found in the slide before and before that about the concept of collaboration and the concept of networking, what you're doing, and I just put in the two slides because it shows the loss of not only cultural heritage, but also of historical knowledge of the archive in Chernihiv, but also kind of as a positive marker here on the slide, the Sucho initiative. I think what you're doing is I presented this in another presentation as a best practice example of citizen science that is deeply embedded in bottom-up motivation. And it couldn't be politically, but also in terms of the legal side of what you're doing, more relevant. So this is something, emergency archive as an immediate reaction, but I think one level where I see a lot of possibility for interaction and also exchange of views is the sustainability question on the one hand, but also the conceptual question. Is that what you're doing right now transferable, and in what way? Because I can, I have prepared some questions for the discussion where I can give more explanation about it. And actually, and this is kind of one of the last slides, what you're doing gives us back the hope in the optimistic kind of the optimistic early days of the digital humanities. Yochai Benkler, he's one of the optimists and the kind of those who were enthusiastic about the possibilities of going digital. So in 2006, Yochai Benkler said that the internet holds a promise of a new information environment. It has also a great practical promise, a dimension of individual freedom, platform for better democratic participation, a medium to foster a more critical and self-reflective culture, and achieve improvements in human development everywhere. We have become a bit cynical about these kind of quotes. In the meantime, seeing what's happening in the social media, or the unsocial media, better to say, and also kind of the trolls and everything, the bots that we know from. But and this is what the picture stands for, the icon stands for. Without the internet, without Telegram, and without social media, the revolution in Belarus wouldn't have been possible. And so this shows the ambivalence of the digital turn. And what you're doing is also on the positive side of what could happen and how you could organize it, and what could be the major questions for the future. And here I have a slide from a workshop in Leipzig 2 or 3 weeks ago, Decolonizing Eastern European Research. And I had the introductory statement of decolonizing research infrastructures, how and why. And these are actually questions that we could also debate upon. So the self-understanding of infrastructures, I think with what you're doing changes. And those who don't see the change should be alerted to it. This is my first point. So the war influences our self-understanding as historians, but also as curators, I think, quite intensively. And here, perspectives to the global South are I think, a very, very exciting perspective to frame Ukraine and what's happening there, not only in this Russian post-Soviet imperialistic scenario, but also see how could what you're doing be a pattern or a role model for other conflict zones in the world. What should we do with our traditional knowledge and collection orders? A lot of hard or tricky questions arise here. The historicity and ambiguity of categories and concepts. We have to find a way to make them part of our research data structure without, of course, making them less readable and less researchable and less findable. And the guiding principles for making controversial knowledge visible. This is, I think, a challenge that we still have no idea how to do that, but this will be also part of what we will be doing in the For Memory Consortium. The skill question, we have to come up with new ways to teach the forthcoming generations. Otherwise, we would have kind of digital unsensitive and blind historians faced with digital-born sources. And last but not least, really also think of it in a practical turn, what strategies and measures are appropriate to support collaborations with colleagues in Ukraine and promote the development of the humanities in Ukraine through exchange. And that's my last slide. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to having your questions. And first of all, another comment, and I will kind of stop my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you for outlining us this position of German historians and what is happening in German academia in this regard, and how the discussion looks like. Thank you for sharing your takeaways out of this discussion. It was also very relevant and important to hear the other part of your presentation about the issues of authenticity and provenance of the data that is collected about this war, but also the abundance of information, what is happening with social media, and very important point on the digital source criticism as another perspective of and the way of looking at those issues. Thank you for the notion on the scholarly activism. This is something that is also very much relevant at the moment for us, and yeah, and might have some comments on that, and probably we'll try to share it with the audience, but after the comment from Dr. Mykola Mahorte, who joined us and kindly agreed to have a commentary on the on the talk by Peter Haslinger. So Mykola Machortek is an Alfred Landecker Lecturer at the Institute of Communication and Media Studies at the University of Bern, where his research is focused on the personalization of news media and the impact of algorithmic biases on news consumption. In his recent work, he has also examined the use of digital technologies for framing political and historical issues in Eastern Europe, interactions between historical memory and propaganda, and the use of digital platforms for Holocaust remembrance. So please, Mykola, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Taras, and also for the great introduction. And also massive thanks for the fascinating talk, Peter. It was really a great pleasure to listen to. I would say that I probably would actually have more questions than comments, because are really fascinating, but a number of points that you actually mentioned. And basically, as Taras kind of spoiled it, I probably would be focusing more on the digital infrastructure side of the things, because something that I'm mostly working these days. But I also would probably have a couple of questions about general historical context. So my first question / comment relates to the point of the decolonization of the Eastern European studies, which is definitely something that we're talking quite a lot with the colleagues too, at least, in those days when I'm talking with, not with the computer scientists, but actually with the Eastern European scholars and historians. And I would say it's also one of the type of the talks when we still struggle to kind of end with a clear conclusion and the end vision of what it actually should look like. Because I think that it really becomes more or less of a consensus that indeed we have to decolonize Eastern European studies. It actually is something that probably is due for quite some decades, to be honest. But what would actually be the end result of the decolonization? And also, especially I would say, I find really very interesting the point that you noted, that indeed, it might be that our current priority should not necessarily be the decolonization, or at least our view of decolonization as actual solution of all our problems that we are currently having in East European studies, but actually indeed more strong embedding of the Ukraine-centered research in the field. So my question for you is, what actually would you say would be the ideal scenario of the decolonization in the East European studies, which is, I know, a super complicated question, but I'm really very much interested in your perspective on this one. And would you actually say that it might actually lead to the situation when it still would be massively focused on the Russia, just because, again, of the very pragmatic reasons of how departments work, both in Germany, but unfortunately, for instance, in the Netherlands, and also how the funding works. So probably we would actually adopt more critical stance on the Russian studies, but they still would remain massively funded compared with, for instance, Ukraine studies or indeed Czech Republic studies. Now let me actually move to more digital things, where I really love the point that you made. I especially found very interesting the point that you made about the importance of actually being more qualitative, which again, something that we talk so much with the colleagues. And my question for you is, how would you actually see it in the practical terms? Because again, I think it's something that a lot of colleagues would agree, especially the colleagues which are coming from, I would say, more critical fields and more humanities-oriented fields. But at the same time, almost every time we're talking with the colleagues about those subjects, we kind of arriving to the same conclusions that yes, being qualitative is so valuable. We definitely need to teach our students to do this. But unfortunately, funders actually want quantitative methods in the applications. And unfortunately, I often have a feeling that it's especially the case when you're actually trying to involve partners from the non-European countries, which already makes the proposals more competitive than when you're actually going for the high-ranked top universities. And then you actually almost forced to actually add some fancy digital computational methods in the applications. Even in the cases when basically people who are on the applications are not necessarily really experts in those methods, but they still feel almost pressure to actually include them and actually involve them in their research to some degree or another. So what is your stance on this one? Would you actually say that you might see it changing in the, let's say, next 10 years? Or would you say that the situation has actually become worse? Because it's something that I'm honestly becoming quite concerned these days. Then my next question concerns the next point about the connection between the field of history and the field of digital forensics. And again, I could not agree more. pretty much when I'm teaching my students, I often tell them, okay, guys, if you really want to learn something which is valuable for you, which might actually pay in the next 2 decades, look into the digital forensics. It's definitely fancy. It's almost as sexy as data science, let's say 10 years ago. However, the question is again, how realistically can we expect it from our history students? Because it's something that we're struggling, for instance, in the computer science quite a lot, because we're actually feeling pressured almost all the time to learn new tricks and new toys, because the field is developing so quickly. We're basically having new models coming up almost every year, as well as new approaches, for instance, for the data preprocessing, to actually teaching our machines how to analyze data. So would you say that history has any chances to kind of catch up with these quick developments? Does it actually have to try to catch up? Or would you say that we can actually try to go a different route? And it actually would be a competitive route, which actually would not force us to tell, okay, it's honestly easier to kind of hire a computer scientist who never worked with history, with historical material, who has zero idea about history, but the guy actually knows the best models in the field. So we just tell him, okay, you know, history is basically something which deals with the fact. Now just run some fancy models for us. So would you say it is the future of our field in the digital humanities? Or would you say that there is some kind of, I would say, more optimistic potential? And probably I will be closing with bombarding user questions. I will just ask one last pattern. So one when I really would like also to hear your opinion. Because in the computer science, we're also increasingly talking about the role of the value-driven design, which is the idea that we actually have to embed ethical and moral values into design of our systems, especially as a system which indeed dealing with the living people, in order to avoid all the problems, you know, that dealing with the racism, with prejudices, with the discrimination. Would you also say that you see it as something that is relevant for the digital humanities, especially in the field of history? And if yes, that what kind of professional values would you say actually matter in this case? So are there a set of certain professional values which are kind of can be universal, at least semi-universal for the discipline, which you actually say, okay, it's really something for us as a designers is really important to keep in mind when we're actually working on the systems or algorithms which dealing with historical data. So thank you very much. Really fascinating talk, and I'm so much looking forward for answers.
Thank you, Mykola, for those great questions. They actually resonate with a lot of things that I wanted to mention. So, Peter, please, the mic is yours.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. So I saw you smiling all the time. So I guess I was not completely wrong with my main points. Okay, decolonization. What would be kind of the output? Or the idea of what the product, so to speak, could look like. It's of course, it would be totally naive to say you can write the history of Ukraine without having a knowledge or also including aspects of Russian and Soviet history. That's quite clear. That would be also not very scientific, so to speak. I think it's a multipolar approach where the decolonization of Soviet or Russian imperial history must find a way to interlink or intersect with a nation and state building analysis of Ukraine. So since I'm not an expert on these questions, I only resort to the history of the Habsburg Empire, which offers also, because Ukrainian history plays quite an important role in it, and the link is also to kind of Ukrainian nation-building processes is quite obvious. There has been some work that tried to unite or kind of fuse many levels that are actually contradictory to each other. Jana Osterkamp came up with a volume on entitled The Cooperative Empire, which is which is rather structural and kind of legal-based approach, kind of constitutional approach, but still we have to find a way to embed expectations of actors in historic developments into contradictory entrenchments, into entanglements that have two sides or a multi-layer dynamic. So I'm thinking of a very complicated model as an interim kind of step towards a clear picture how the pieces of the puzzle fit together. But this is, I'm talking a bit into the blue because I'm not an expert in Ukrainian history, but this is something I would say that in Hungarian history would Hungarian-Slovak, Hungarian-Romanian relationship, Hungarian-Croatian relationship, even the Hungarian-German relationship, Austrian relationship could be dealt with on in this respect. And I think it's that the main aim would be to make transparent the mindset and also the mental geographies of the agents involved, but also how they were interpreted and canonized. I think this canonizing is extremely important, because if you canonize something, you exclude alternative visions of history. And if you can discern the canon from that, what's left out, you can bring it back into the picture again. And this is perhaps one leap that could lead us to not a mono-visual, a mono-perspectivity of what's happened, but grouping different perspectives in a way that enrich all the perspectives involved. This is now a very conceptual answer, but I hope it gives an idea of what my suggestion would be. Yeah, quantitative, qualitative. I would say, coming as a historian, one problem I'm having with these great big data approaches is that we normally talk about the veto power of a source. That means that if you have 5 cartons or 5 boxes of sources, and you try to reconstruct, let's say, a negotiation between 2 political parties, and you have all the sources, and you have in total 300 sources, and one source tells a different story than all the 299 others. The first step is to see, is there any falsification or misplacement of that source? And if the quality proof says, no, this source it's valid, it's salient, you have to include it into your analysis. You have to rethink everything that is in your mind until you include the story of that single source into the whole story. So quantitative approaches in terms of leaving out kind of small bits of information and telling a big story based on a vast amount of material, that doesn't happen with that's not a salient approach for historians. Actually, I wouldn't only talk about big data, which is not the big deal for historians, but small data. I think the quantitative approach is a good interim step for acquiring or managing knowledge of a much broader pool of sources that you have. But you still have to take that final step of plausibility proof, or whatever you might call it, of including contradictory information into the broad picture. And this is hard work. And therefore you have to very much know about how this kind of technical or computer generated output, why is that the case, what you have as a result. And you have kind of a double check if searching otherwise would bring different research results. So the veto power of the sources is, I think, one problem in this respect with too much of quantitative resources. Also the concepts, big data approaches rely on stable, firm, and not questionable data concepts that are behind the data that you're using. And actually a concept criticism, a concept sensitive data management is still, it's a big challenge, I know, but it's still, I don't see good solutions for that. And last but not least, so Andreas Vickers also, I very much like his concept of the digital hermeneutic. So this is a step in the right direction, but we still have a lot of work to do ahead of us. Actually, we have a cross-departmental group at the Herder Institute dealing with theories and concepts of digital source critique. And all these questions come also from an in-depth knowledge of how collections are generated, what archives do, and what are the pitfalls of relying too much on the selection of pre-selected material. And pre-selected data is basically the same problem as pre-selected material. Digital forensics. I don't believe that a way out of this dilemma is to train every historian deeply into IT competences. That won't work. We have to find a way to develop what I call a knowledge of plausibility. So kind of looking at a digitally created source or source landscape and training them to look at at traces where kind of you would think again and would call somebody to look deeper into the kind of structure of the digital source. I think this is a new field of cooperation with computer scientists, also putting puzzling questions to them. Falsification of sources was always a topic in historical research. So we know examples from medieval and early modern period where falsified sources had such a big political significance that we treat them as sources. They were just falsified by those implanting them into archives. But still, I think the dialogue between information technology and historians or any kind of humanists, that we have to find a way of translating our main concerns and kind of retrieving also the ethical concerns that we have with how sources are treated by machines, so to speak. So these care principles or any kind of alert lists of what could be wrong with a source, at least to have some basic knowledge of how technology functions and what to look at in the data structure in order to kind of have an alert signal ringing, and then finding a way to constantly clarifying and finding tools also to let them run over a source, a selection of sources to send back alarm signals that you have go after. Moral values in data structures. This is highly relevant for the digital humanities and digital history. I would rather speak not so much of moral values, but ethical considerations and ethical aspects. You can't do the history of the Holocaust just on the basis of big data methods and big data tools. That would, the outcome would be highly precarious in terms of what it means for memory cultures and our kind of the transgenerational dealing with complex and highly sensitive historical issues. You need to have on the side a constant assessment process that kind of at certain steps of the research or the data life cycle steps in and looks at this interim results and kind of holds a list of ethical questions to ask against it. And if you find, then you can kind of proceed to the next step. But these are questions actually that we will also address quite eagerly and quite enthusiastically in our For Memory Consortium, which will start, by the way, in March next year. And this is something where please contact me also. This will be also something that we try to come up with solutions, handouts, lists that are especially modeled after topics and source problems that are related to Central and Eastern European studies. Okay, I hope I answered all your questions, but please more. So
thank you, Peter. It actually, your last notion reminded me that Mykola actually had recently, one of his recent talks was titled "Do algorithms or can algorithms remember Holocaust?" So it was very much relevant, and it's a whole another topic, of course, but worth and important to discuss. We still have a few more minutes in case there are questions from the audience, so that okay, so I can see raising hands, Migle and then Bohdan Shumilovic. So maybe we can collect questions and then give a better opportunity to answer. So Migle, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your talk. It was super interesting. And yeah, thank you also, Mykola, for your questions. It was also super interesting. I had also many kind of similar ideas or questions in mind, so we kind of raised them all, but I will just ask one question that kind of builds up on this question on decolonization and maybe a bit digs deeper. I hope it will not sound like a ramble, but what I heard from your talk, you kind of want to problematize this decolonization discourse on Ukraine or Eastern Europe, because it kind of gives attention to the countries or regions as sort of peripheries. And instead, you kind of would like to bring forth the subject status of sort of agency status of these countries and not perceive them as peripheries, which is kind of Soviet discourse. But at the same time, what I find interesting, you mentioned that in Germany, sort of in practice in Germany, there's still not a lot of attention given to so-called small countries, right? Or like whatever, like Ukraine or even like maybe Poland, to research them, right? So I see this kind of a paradox, like, or how do you perhaps see this paradox being solved? Like peripherization is on the one hand bad, we shouldn't peripherize and kind of focus on these so-called small countries. But at the same time, there is a lack of peripherization or lack on these small countries in German history or German like history practices, perhaps practice of German historians. So, and I get this argument of the need to complicate histories and include diverse perspectives, but I wonder, like for that, you also need like institutional support and attention of academics in particular places. So my question is basically, do you see this kind of attention in Germany within like historians in Germany that is sustainable attention that kind of that deals with this paradox, you know, like not peripherize Eastern Europe or Ukraine, but at the same time still focus on this place. So I hope I'm not repeating like Mykola's comment, but I'm trying to kind of pin down a bit into this practical level on what's happening in German academia. So thank you.
Thank you, Migla. I saw a raised hand from Bohdan. Bohdan, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm here, but I'm walking in the city, so I will not switch on the camera, if I may. But I hope you hear me. So my question is, thank you, Peter, for this beautiful talk, and all the questions are very relevant and interesting. You said that we need to kind of train students in a new way, and this is my hard question for myself, also to you. So how to train them? I'm just thinking, basically, we have those hybrid professors who are still thinking in a kind of critical resources paradigm, and then using some tools, digital tools, and being basically hybrid because they are living in a semi-digital world, but then thinking in a traditional, or let's say, like Andreas Fickers, he is talking about this continuously, that we need to take these best practices from the past. But my question is about like these heuristic metaphors. So for instance, when we talk about colonial or post-colonial, Soviet, post-Soviet, this is not really a reality. This is kind of metaphor that scholars use to describe reality. And then how to teach this, because for instance, I had extensive discussions with some German scholars who would say before the war that, you know, post-Soviet situation is not post-colonial situation, and I agree with them, but this is difficulty of inventing new metaphors. So my question is whether this digital training way of students will have a new forms of making new metaphors, heuristic metaphors, or do we still operate in the kind of traditional way, but just replace some impossibilities to describe reality with digital tools? Thank you.
And how to make it interdisciplinary then also. I saw the raising hand from Christopher Gilly, so this would be probably the last question, and then Peter can answer. Sorry,
there is no sound.
There is something wrong with the microphone, probably.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. You were talking about maintaining the authenticity, integrity, and reliability of documents, digital documents, and web documents. I was just, Mikola might want to talk about this as well, but what about the role of archivists in doing this? You didn't bring up their role as an intermediary maybe between historians and IT people. Also, I'm wondering specifically about the German historiographical situation. I'm wondering why you're being so negative, Professor Haslinger, in that you compare to the UK or France, there's an abundance of German historiography. Maybe comparing it to the US and Canada is the wrong thing. And if I can just throw one last one in there, it's interesting that contradicted to that, most of the people, with the 3 exceptions, who you quoted as German historians talking about Ukraine, didn't actually publish on Ukraine before 2014. So I was wondering if there's any, is there a difference between the people who were published about Ukraine before 2014? I think 3 people you mentioned were, but the rest weren't. So are they saying something different to the people who've come newly to Ukrainian studies?
These are the great questions, Christopher. Thank you. So Peter, please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So I've kind of worked myself through the 3 bundles of questions, and I begin with Migle. By the way, good to see you. I really liked your article. You saw the quote. I hope there wasn't a typo in it. Okay. So what disturbs or my concern about this sole fixation on decolonization was, as I said, that you just take a power axis and deconstruct that, but you don't step out of the logic of the power axis. My idea would be, how far could you write the history of an Ukrainian town, the country of Ukraine as a whole, or a region, without the need or the necessity to bring on Moscow or St. Petersburg? So I'm saying this, so I'm not an expert. So, but in the history of the Habsburg Empire, there are some studies that are showing quite well also the intensity of entanglement and the intensity of kind of going into local regional developments from the center that are not only, so we are kind of deeply embedded into the history of the 20th century, where this power axis definitely is a crucial point. But even in there, you see fringes and counterpositions that you can discover. And my concern was, given that I come from a different academic background, so in Austria, kind of the things go a little bit differently, that you have to step out of your colonial relationship in order to have an independent point of view to see where this really matters, and where it's rather the question of how to totally shift your attention and your standpoint in order to disentangle yourself from this sterile, so to speak, look towards Moscow or St. Petersburg. I hope I made it a bit clearer than in the presentation. So there was a second part of your question. Institutions have die-hard habits, and also professions sometimes do have die-hard habits. But I see some change when I kind of grew up academically, and there was a young kind of student working on my PhD. In Germany, it was the solid rule that you have to have one of the two major works, one of the two books. One must be on Russia or the Soviet Union, and the second could be, if you had the first on Russia, you chose the Soviet Union, or the other way around, or you could go for East Central Europe, mostly Poland, perhaps a bit Czech history, but Slovenian history or Slovakian history is not a good decision. Or you could go for the Balkans, and then it's mostly Yugoslav, perhaps Bulgarian history. Romanian history is always kind of a solitary thing. So there are logics in the field that change hard. So we are not too deep into the period after February 24th. So I can't predict if there will be major change in interest. There will be a change in the choice of topics for PhDs and Habilitationsschriften, because you can't access archives in Russia and Belarus. And well, in Ukraine, it's hard right now, but it's not impossible in the perhaps a midterm or long-term perspective. But I see a more bleak future for those who are in need of archival material that comes from Russia or Belarus. Even if you have related material in Riga or Helsinki or elsewhere. So there is a redefinition of opportunity structures anyway for the next generation. And if that leads to the materialization or the implementation of Ukrainian studies on the ground of professorships that are comparative or whatever, but have an explicit focus in Ukraine, I can't predict that. But so the East European studies are really at a turning point when it comes to what should the future of the discipline be in the design of the subregions, and also the delimitation of the subregions. There might see some changes, but also kind of how transdisciplinary or respectively regional what kind of a regional object we have in front of us when it comes to kind of single professors. The Baltic states are always kind of a rather situated in the extramural institutions. And it would be quite interesting to see the GWZO in Leipzig, if it is kind of now more going for Ukrainian studies than it was before. But that actually, if I may, I would take Christopher's question, because it's quite related to this, the UK and France. Of course, I'm totally aware of the fact that Germany and Austria and also Switzerland actually have much more expertise than France is not that bad, Britain is not that bad, but look at Italy or Spain. So it's a disaster actually. They don't have that there are single persons who have a broad kind of portfolio of what they should do and stand for. And yeah, I don't want to do any bashing here, but still, Germany has a lot of expertise, and it has an infrastructure that's internationally, at least at the level of US and Canada, I would say, also in the multitude of what we're doing. Still, we have kind of blanks and kind of a disbalance within the field. That was my main argument. And so the change that's ahead of us will be interesting. You asked about the archivists. I had them in 1 or 2 slides as kind of a thing that I didn't really highlight. I'm also in dense contact with the archival school in Marburg, which is not a local affair, but kind of trains the archivists outside of Bavaria. Bavaria has something special again, but everybody who doesn't come from Bavaria has to attend that school and has a guarantee actually for a post in an archival structure or collection or a memory institution. I think this is a key question that we need to redesign, and this is something which brings me to Bogdan's question. So the archivist will not be the person who just brings the material and the boxes and answers questions where to find things, and probably will write a chat or an article about new findings of a newly kind of archival collections. I think they will become part of this of lab-like scenarios where they co-author research, analytical pieces of research. So a deeper kind of some sources might form the knot of explaining how to deal with sources, but also the curator's expertise should become much more visible in the research process and also the data lifecycle process. And I think we just have to find new forms of co-authoring a researcher plus an archivist who have the same sources in front of them, describing them from the perspective and kind of highlighting where the differences are, but also how we should deal with sources. And digital-born sources are, of course, a special challenge of that. So I think this lab-like scenarios, there are some digital humanities centers that do that in linguistics and also other fields of the humanities. It's much more present. With the historians, at least in Germany, we don't have a full-fledged kind of activity in this respect. I'm just looking at now Bogdan's question, how to train, and I see 2 aspects of your question. One being kind of the digital humanists, how we should train them, and one being East European historians and what to do with metaphors. Metaphors, we can't live without metaphors. I would rather speak of concepts or assumptions or hypotheses. This is part and parcel of what we're doing. It would be only problematic to leave the metaphors in order to bring us further in our research process. We have to take our time and question these metaphors and hypotheses and whatever you might call them concepts constantly when you reach a new stage in your research process. And we also actually we are what we are doing right now in essentially East European studies, so Osteuropäische Geschichte, so Eastern European history. I think we'll come to the point, and there were many also web conferences on this. What does the situation after February 24th mean to the very substance and the very kind of foundations of our discipline? We are in the spotlight, not only for months, but it might be for years, we don't know. And we will stay in the spotlight, but we lose part of our research possibilities in Russia and Belarus, and now in Ukraine, it's also very hard. We might find a way in the with digital methods to to make up for this, but we have a greater attention, the broader portfolio versus less opportunities and some pitfalls that are created by these. I don't want to go back to the Cold War kind of mirroring of criminology or something like this, that we have to kind of apply methodologies that don't give us the full picture or the full possibilities of analyzing our questions. So also, it's I'm aware of the fact that I don't have a clear kind of cut model for how to deal with this question, but this question will be dealt with in for memory, but also we do it at the Herder Institute. So I rather offer or would signal back that these are core questions, not only related to the situation Ukraine is in right now, but it's a valid and actually existential. These are existential questions for the field of history. If we don't find a way to bring the discipline forward into a more digitalized and more, let's say, method-based way to work, that also opens up avenues of collaboration with other disciplines like medicine or climate research or whatever you name it, then we will end up in kind of a very narrow and lonesome place, and this shouldn't happen. And the questions, actually, all the questions you came up with, also with Mikola's question, thank you for the comment, which wasn't a comment, which was rather kind of bringing my thoughts, trying to bring my thoughts further to the cliffhanger positions. I think I take this with me as a list of questions that would make sense to deal in forums like this and networking, and stay tuned to and bringing in the expertise that you're just gaining over there. So I hope I didn't forget any important aspect of your questions. If I did, please tell me.
Well, it looks like we have elaborated on all the topics that were brought up. So it was a great discussion, and it was a great presentation, Peter. Thank you for this presentation. Thank you, Mikola, for bringing up very important and relevant question, and thank you for this audience for very rich and thought-provoking discussion, actually. So I also enjoyed it a lot. I hope our participants in the audience as well. We are running out of time. I know that Professor Haslinger has to go for another event, so we probably should finish this one. And I just wanted to mention you that the recording of this event will be published on our YouTube channel, both in Ukrainian and English version, so that it will be possible to revisit our discussion further. And now I just want to wish you good evening and stay safe. And thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the questions and comments.
Thank you.
Very much.
Goodbye.
Bye.